Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and this week we are looking at World War II. And we're going to look at World War II over 2 weeks. So we'll look at the origins of World War II, particularly in Europe, and we will also look at the American home front and mobilization at home in the United States. And then next week we will look at the Pacific Theater. So World War II this week and next week. So there's a lot of reasons why to study World War II, obviously. One would be in terms of ramifications for international relations, and particularly this would be the so-called lessons of Munich. And I'll show you an image from the Munich conference here in a little bit. But basically, the Munich conference was in 1938 when the Allies, particularly the British and the French, Neville Chamberlain infamously appeased Hitler by granting him the Czechoslovakian Sudetenland in 1938. Historically, American policymakers, European policymakers have looked at this as one of the great mistakes, that they could have stopped Hitler while they had the chance, but they didn't. And this has been used by many policymakers in the United States to characterize U.S. foreign relations since. Even what's gone on in the Ukraine, some American policymakers have characterized that as that the United States had to stand up and prevent the lessons of Munich, prevent another Munich crisis in which an aggressor was appeased. The truth of the matter was, though, and this is the truth of the matter, is that I don't know that the United States has actually witnessed another threat that was similar to the threat posed by Hitler in terms of immediate expansionism, grand scale expansionism. And so, generally speaking, when you look at the Cold War, for example, the Munich conference, the lessons of Munich are really associated with exaggerating threat out of a reaction to World War II. Of course, the expanded power of the United States as a global power. Yeah, that's very significant, obviously. The United States really becomes a superpower in the aftermath of World War II, largely because of the development of the Cold War, of which the United States and the USSR were both complicit in leading to the development of a Cold War. But the United States today has over 700 international military bases. We are an international power. We give incredible amounts of international aid to countries in our attempt to build allies and strengthful coalitions throughout the globe, or strong coalitions throughout the globe. So you really see the United States really comes of age as an international power after World War II. And of course, that's very significant in terms of both positive things, in terms of global aid and support. For example, in the Philippines, when the typhoon hit recently, the United States would have been at the forefront of providing assistance to that. Of course, it's also we've seen a heightened involvement of the United States as a military power in the world as well. Heightened understanding of human rights in international law. Of course, the end of World War II and the revelations of the Holocaust really kind of creates the concept today of war crimes and the modern concept of human rights. It helps us understand both fascism and totalitarianism. It helps us understand the drawbacks of isolationism in the United States. A lot of people in the United States today are calling for isolationism, and in a global international world, isolationism, at least during the 1930s, proved to be a mistake for the United States. The United States could have almost certainly helped prevent World War II, or at least the extent of World War II. But because of our isolationism, we were really completely unprepared for the conflict. Um, Emergence of atomic and nuclear weapons, of course, that's very significant. Goes without saying. For the United States, the threat of nuclear annihilation, I'm sure you guys have heard or seen the cartoons like Duck and Cover and these types of things. But the threat in the 1950s, in the 60s, the threat of nuclear annihilation very much affected how people thought about their everyday lives. And there's been some great authors who have written books about how the threat of nuclear annihilation in the 1950s encouraged um, more conservative gender norms and sexual norms. And of course, lastly, understanding the role of race in U.S. history. World War II was a jumpstart to civil rights, both for women and for minorities. Um, we'll talk more about that as we go, but it was really the modern feminist movement, the modern civil rights movement were really born during World War II. And that was something that scholars didn't recognize for quite some time. Most scholars would have started civil rights with Brown versus the Board of Education and Martin Luther King. But historians have really shown that civil rights really starts during World War II. Um, the role of race in U.S. history too. A lot of time, World War II can be a difficult subject because Americans like to um, make it a mythical kind of thing, like a moment that the United States could do no wrong. But of course, if you look at particularly the Pacific theater um, of the war, and that goes for the home front as well, it reveals a very, very deep-seated racism on the part of the United States, particularly when looking at Japan during the conflict. In many ways, the war in the Pacific on the United States' side was a race war, and also, of course, the internment of Japanese Americans at home. And so, there's also some more negative things um, that are happening when we look at World War II that we can understand. And racism in the United States history, which we've talked a lot about throughout this term, was very evident in the conflict. Another thing I would say too is that a debate over laissez-faire or unregulated or less regulated capitalism versus more social democratic approaches like the New Deal approach, that big debate really comes to a new level during the Second World War, and in many respects, we see the beginnings of the kind of arguments that we're having in society today happen during World War II. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So, why does it occur in brief? Just the short nub of it. The Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, of course, put tremendous guilt and reparations on Germany, which created animosities, decimated the German economy, and ultimately those factors, economic factors, the Treaty of Versailles, created the type of atmosphere that would allow for fascists like Hitler to rise up in Germany, using revenge against the French, using racism against Jewish people as a blame on economic situations, scapegoating people basically. The Nazis used race and other peoples as a way of creating nationalism in the country, and using that nationalism to push the Nazis to political power, which came amid tremendous political stagnation in Germany. Hitler actually never really won an election. The one time he got 39% of the vote, it was more than the other parties, but nobody had a majority. And because of the Weimar Republic's constitution at the time, Hitler was in fact appointed. He didn't become chancellor because of true victory. In the Weimar Republic in Germany, you had to have a true majority. So he was appointed, and so the Nazis came to power in part in Germany because of political stagnation, economic problems, the war guilt and the reparations, and of course fascists who used these things to label enemies largely on the basis of race as a way of creating national unity and power. Of course, also empire, right? We read Arc of Empire, or we're reading Arc of Empire, Hunt and Levine, empire and power seeking. When you look at the Pacific, particularly, the war in the Pacific is the result of two empires pursuing their interests in the Pacific over quite a period of time. For the United States, you probably go back to Matthew C. Perry and opening the door with Japan in 1853. But then, of course, certainly the Philippine-American War, the acquisition of Hawaii, the United States had expanded territorially and had made influence in markets in Asia a vested and appointed concern. Japan likewise had great endeavors to expand and become an empire, and when they began to do this in the early 1930s, it was almost inevitably going to run up against or challenge the United States. And so in a lot of respects, World War II was about the contestation of two empires in the Pacific. So here you see Mussolini, the Italian fascist, who very much Hitler modeled a lot of his things on, and of course Adolf Hitler. I wanted to briefly define fascism. Fascism is extreme nationalism. Sometimes it's referred to as chauvinistic. It's generally militaristic, and it centers around the idea that a nation is made up of a particular race or ethnicity of people. And this view believes that this race or So the belief is that this particular race or ethnicity, this group of people that make up the nation, is somehow facing repression at the hands of other particular races and ethnicity, and must expand and purify its territory using largely repressive and militaristic methods. So it promotes the expansion of a racial or an ethnic nation at the expense of other peoples and nations. They would certainly have seen them as kind of lesser civilized people. So it's, in a lot of respects, it's the idea of purifying a nation that you see as fundamentally centered around race. And generally, it's militaristic, and generally, it is based on scapegoating people on the basis of their ethnicity or race. So that's fascism. And of course, in Germany, we all know, Hitler most significantly used the Jewish people as the scapegoat, and Hitler promoted what he called Lebensraum, and Lebensraum was a term that means living space. He sought to expand Germany into the areas of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, and his goal was to create living space for the so-called Aryan people at the expense of the Jewish people and the Slavic peoples and the Russian peoples and the Polish peoples that were all in those areas. Brief rundown. This is just chronology. You don't have to freak out and start scribbling down notes here. I just wanted to give you a rundown of the movement up to World War II. Of course, I mentioned Hitler appointed as chancellor in 1933 after he got 39% of the vote. He begins rearming. He pulls Germany out of the League of Nations. In 1936, Hitler occupies the Rhineland, and the Rhineland was basically a demilitarized zone that was on the border of France. France had encouraged the creation of this area at the end of World War II for fear of another German invasion. In 1938, Hitler took Austria. He also obtains the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia as a result of the Munich Conference. In 1939, he, of course, invades Poland. After that, he's going to invade Denmark, France, Norway at the beginning, using his blitzkrieg military strategy. Italy's war began in the 30s as well, attempting particularly to recolonize Ethiopia. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1932. By 1937, they invaded China proper. The Japanese theater of war in China was incredibly brutal, not on a scale unlike the Nazis, though there wasn't per se a mass industrial slaughter, but there was tremendous war crimes, horrible war crimes, particularly during the rape of Nanjing in 1937. Japan has to create an empire for the need of resources, and so as a result of that, their imperial goals really do head up against the United States. Here, the area of the Sudetenland, if you look to, as you're facing the screen, if you look to the right, and you see the little kind of triangular thing sticking into eastern Germany, that is the so-called Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and that is what the Allies, with over here on your left is Neville Chamberlain, and of course Hitler's in the middle. The French Prime Minister is between Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. Um, but this is Munich 1938. The Allies made an agreement without even really consulting the Czechoslovakians, actually, to give Germany the Czech Sudetenland. Hitler was demanding it because he said these people were truly German people, and um, that Germany had a right to control this area. Neville Chamberlain, of course, famously lands in London and steps off the plane with the treaty in his hand, saying, "We've achieved peace in our time." It was one of the most ironic and tragic events in history, because, of course, only a year later the war would really begin as Hitler blitzed into Poland. Chamberlain, of course, would be removed as prime minister and replaced ultimately by Winston Churchill. FDR's policy, FDR was an internationalist, really, in many respects, but he was challenged by isolationist thinkers in the United States who very much did not want, they wanted the United States to stay out of World War II. Many, many Americans during this time period believed that World War I was the wrong choice for Americans. They believed that World War I, they thought, was due to the manipulations and desires of major arms manufacturers. And so, during the buildup of as things like the Munich conference are happening during the buildup of World War II, the United States really sits on the sidelines, basically saying we will not have anything to do with it. There was a series of neutrality acts that were passed between 1935 and 1941. These began with something called the Johnson Debt Default Act, which basically the United States was very upset that they had never been paid back for World War I. The European powers owed the United States millions, billions in debt from World War I, and we refused to trade with anybody that owed us any kind of debt. And so it was a way of us, it was a way of the United States effectively saying, we're not going to have anything to do with this because you owe us money. As the war begins to develop, the United States begins to see the situation more urgently, and FDR in 1939 drives home what was called cash carry. Cash carry meant what it sounded like. It meant that if the British wanted to come to the United States and buy a ship, for example, they could do so. But they'd have to pay for it up front, in cash, so to speak, which is impossible. During a war, wars are inherently going to create debt. The idea of being able to actually pay for stuff up front was completely unfeasible. Later, shortly after that, the United States traded some World War I destroyers, I think there were 50 of them, for a collection of British Atlantic bases, many of which we still possess today, all along the Atlantic, ranging from South America all the way up to areas near Greenland. And the United States, of course, is a part and parcel, a step towards the United States expanding as an international power. And those bases were seen as a way to protect the United States' influence of this hemisphere. 1941 was the year, though, that the Nazis began. They were really pummeling. France was beaten. France had been beaten in 1940 in a matter of 6 weeks. The Nazis had taken over pretty much all of Europe. I'll show you a map in just a little bit. And in June of 1941, the Nazis invaded Russia. It became a desperate situation, and this led to Roosevelt finally, through using his fireside chats as a way of negotiating with the people, but also pressing Congress, and they passed Lend-Lease. And Lend-Lease basically sounds what it means what it sounds like. It's a program to lend war materials to the Allies, and was by far the most significant aspect of the United States' war effort. We gave tremendous amounts of supply to the British, to resistance fighters, to the Soviet Union. It was really significant for the United States in terms of supporting the Allies in the war. And this began before Pearl Harbor, which of course happens on December 7th, 1941. This is a look at the map so you can get an idea of the expansion of Germany after the invasion of the Soviet Union, which of course the invasion of the Soviet Union was the thing that really damned the Nazis, because they got bogged down and were really decimated during the winter after they invaded the Soviet Union. Of course, Pearl Harbor. This is the USS Arizona sinking. It would be Pearl Harbor that led the United States to officially declare war on Japan, which we, of course, we had cut off trade to them at this point. The Japanese believed that they were expanding. And this is one thing that Admiral Yamamoto, who led the task force, the carrier task force that attacked Pearl Harbor, one thing that they understood was that Japan was expanding as an empire, and that the expansion of their empire was necessarily going to create war with the United States because of areas like the Philippines, and of areas of other allies like the British in the French in Indochina and Southeast Asia, and of course all the way down into Indonesia. The Japanese knew it was going to create war with the United States, and so they believed that they were better off to try and take out the United States' Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack. The idea was that if you could attack the United States and knock out the Pacific Fleet, the Japanese rationalized that they would be able to entrench themselves in their Pacific Empire to such that the United States would not be able to turn and make war at a speed with which they could really, undermine the Japanese after they had entrenched their empire. But of course, the United States, the carriers were out of port at that time. The Japanese missed the aircraft carriers. World War II was a war of aircraft carriers in the Pacific to a large degree, of course. But also, the United States, the Japanese really underestimated the United States' ability to mobilize for the war and to retool. And they did so much, much more quickly than the Japanese could have expected. And the result was that by the end of May 1942, after the Battle of Midway, the United States had really stopped the offensive tide of the Japanese Empire and was beginning in subsequent battles at places like the Battle of Coral Sea. The United States, with the Battle of Midway, was beginning to turn the war against Japan. In some respects, by the end of 1942, the Japanese were beginning a slow kind of defeat in a war of attrition against the United States. So this attack happened on Sunday morning, December 7th. There were 3 sorties, and of course, the United States was caught by surprise. The Japanese hoped for a quick win in the Pacific. They thought that was their only chance, was a quick win. Of course, famously, FDR labels this a day that would live in infamy, and declares war on Japan. And of course, after that, the Nazis, Hitler, declared war on the United States, which led to a prompt declaration from the United States on Germany. At home, the war at home becomes a war for freedom. And this is one of the reasons why World War II is so significant. It becomes very much an extension, in some respects, of ideas behind the New Deal, which was about, in many ways, was about freedom for work, freedom, security in life. And so FDR promotes what's called his 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, from want, from fear, freedom of worship. And coupled with this call domestically and the Atlantic Conference in 1942, World War II really becomes, for the United States, a war to bring freedom and self-determination to the world. It motivated decolonization throughout the developing world. It motivated civil rights, and it also motivated business people to promote a more free enterprise system. Of course, the civil rights elements are going to be resisted quite a lot by the status quo, and we know that the civil rights for women and for African Americans is in many respects still going on today. So when you look at the scale of the war, these are just some statistics. Of course, the war was full mobilization at home. There was rationing of the people on things like how much milk you drank, on when you could eat meat, on when you could buy gas, on giving your scrap metal to the United States, of encouragement to buy war bonds to help fund the conflict. course, it's also during this time when we go from a class tax to a mass tax. A lot of times people look at FDR's or FDR, Woodrow Wilson, and his support for the income tax during his presidency, and they view that as the origins of their own kind of, the taxation of middle-class people out of their paycheck. But this was actually a development associated more with World War II. Before World War II, income tax came from the wealthiest 4 million people's salaries. After World War II, it becomes expanded, and so-called the beginning of the mass tax, in which ultimately today everyone's paycheck has an income tax taken from it, rather than just the wealthiest. During the war, because of the necessity of the war, spending was up more than it had been in the last 150 years combined. And so they had to fund the conflict, which was why they had to go to this tax system. There's 15 million men drafted, 216,000 women served in the armed forces. Many served in, of course, private industry. 25,000 Native Americans served as code talkers. 125,000 African Americans also served in a segregated United States military during the war. As I mentioned earlier, Lend-Lease was the biggest, probably the most important thing for the United States when it came to World War II. And industry, manufacturers, car manufacturers, ship manufacturers, retooled to build war equipment. However, FDR had to coax them. They were not necessarily gung-ho voluntary about it. FDR had to offer incentives to big businesses, which were things like very good government contracts, guarantees of profits, these types of things. He had to offer these incentives to get these companies to build the war machines that the United States needed. And the biggest companies, the biggest corporations received the most spending, which is a trend moving on today of larger and larger corporations and less in the way of small manufacturers in the United States. You're seeing, what you're looking at in the picture is the construction of a Liberty ship. The Liberty ships were designed, they were very rudimentary ships. They were kind of welded together in 4 big pieces. But these ships were the ships that were used to ship goods, transit goods from the United States to our Lend-Lease allies, in particularly Great Britain. These ships got sunk a lot, so it could be very dangerous. But it was believed that if one could make something like 2 voyages, then it would be a successful venture. Henry J. Kaiser was one of the most famous shipbuilders, and he could build one of these Liberty ships in about 2 weeks. These ships were the ships that really made Lend-Lease work. We produced massive amounts, 40 billion bullets, 300,000 planes, 76,000 ships, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million guns, incredible amount of productivity. The result is, during World War II, economic growth. Though important to note, when the United States comes out of World War II, that was not an economic boom time. The United States had some economic issues for a few years at the end of the war. Debt, of course, is part and parcel to this as well. On the home front, of course, we have women entering the workforce. You have huge advertising promoting the war. However, in terms of women, the advertising largely promoted their employment being temporary. Family and domesticity was oftentimes promoted in advertisements of women in work. There's also many were promoting a 5th freedom. Remember the 4 freedoms. A 5th freedom being a free enterprise freedom. Of course, the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans. You can find this document is on our modules, so you can check this out if you want to read the whole thing. Was it a race war, right? I wouldn't say it was fundamentally the first motivation, but you see racism really come out a lot in the Second World War, both in the Pacific Theater and at home in the United States. Double V for victory. You know, African Americans fought for the country. They fought in the segregated armed forces, and they were fighting for the ideal of freedom. That's really what World War II became about for Americans. And so the double V for victory was victory abroad and victory at home in terms of equality, racial equality, and also women's equality.
This right here, now go talk about the turning. I want to talk briefly about the turning point in Europe real quick, because we can't forget about what happens in the European theater. The Germans, of course, built something called the Atlantic Wall, and this map makes it look like there was actually a true wall in these areas. In reality, the Atlantic Wall was a string of defensive fortifications that the Nazis built, particularly in places like the northern coast of Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, to prevent or to defend against the inevitable oncoming Allied invasion we call D-Day. The Atlantic Wall, I've been to the Atlantic Wall in Belgium. If you ever want to go to the Atlantic Wall near the border with France in Belgium. It's not far from Dunkirk, actually, and it is the most well-preserved portion of the Atlantic Wall, and you can tour it, and it's quite incredible. It was an elaborate installation of fortification, bunkers, machine gun turrets, anti-aircraft and flak guns, pillboxes, concrete bunkers, all along this area, also built in the Channel Islands between Great Britain and Europe to defend against the D-Day invasion that was going to come, of course, ultimately on June 6, 1944. The Atlantic Wall was overseen by, ultimately, around the time of D-Day, by Erwin Rommel. And Erwin Rommel tried to advise Hitler to maintain the force strength as it had been laid out, but Hitler would be tricked by the Allies into moving his forces, at least parts of them, up near the narrowest point between Great Britain and Europe, which was the area of the Pas-de-Calais. He thought that would be the area that the Allies would attack, and it was largely through misinformation that he thought that, and it was ultimately a very, very disastrous mistake potentially for Germany. Here you see Operation Overlord. You see on June 6, 1944, you see the American soldiers, Allied soldiers, I should say, deploying on the beaches of Normandy. The D-Day operation landed at 5 different beaches on Normandy. The beaches were Gold Beach, Sword Beach, Juneau, Omaha, and Utah. And these were the landing zones for the American invasion of Europe, D-Day, Operation Overlord, which was overseen by General Eisenhower. The Allies had used various methods to try to trick the Germans into thinking that the invasion was going to occur at the Pas-de-Calais as opposed to at Normandy. They created a false army regiment, actually, inflatable tanks, tents, cardboard cutouts, the whole 9 yards over in an area near the narrowest point in the English Channel, so that when the Luftwaffe would fly over to bomb London, they would see this and they would report back that there's a buildup there. They had false intelligence documents that were leaked and designed for the Germans to intercept that suggested that. And ultimately, as I mentioned, Hitler will redeploy many of his troops from areas like Normandy up to the Pas-de-Calais, thus making Normandy more vulnerable and helping to make the D-Day operation more effective, or successful, I should say. It was, of course, effective, successful. D-Day was the largest military operation in history, as well as, obviously, the largest amphibious landing in history. And you see here soldiers leaving what were called the Higgins boats. These were these landing crafts that would be incredibly uncomfortable to be in, because they were very shallow, and so they really felt all the waves. People would get seasick in these. You can't see out the sides, and then the door drops down, and effectively you have to jump out into the water with bullets hurling at you. Here is General Dwight D. Eisenhower addressing Allied soldiers the day before D-Day on June 5th, 1944. Eisenhower planned and led the D-Day invasion from England and, of course, Great Britain. And, of course, he carried a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety over this operation because of the because of the scale of the fortifications that he knew that Allied forces were going to go up against, of resistance that they were going to go up against in Europe when they landed. But of course, D-Day was a success, and ultimately the Allies will begin to push the Germans back. And over the next year, they will push the Germans back into, of course, all the way into Germany, ultimately obtaining the defeat of Germany in May of 1945.
A few more slides, guys. Yalta in 1945. This is Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. When you look at their posture, I mean, obviously, there's some obvious things there. FDR and Churchill, somewhat friends, and also not in military gear. Roosevelt very much played kind of an intermediary with Stalin and Churchill. And Stalin and Churchill really didn't like each other, and Stalin and FDR didn't trust each other. At this conference, though, at Yalta in 1945, FDR sought to work with his allies. And so FDR at this conference made suggestions to Stalin, or at least Stalin took them this way, that the United States, so long as Stalin could help the United States in the war, particularly the war in Asia, FDR implied, or at least Stalin believed FDR implied, that he would overlook attempts by Stalin to occupy areas of Poland and Eastern Europe and, of course, Eastern Germany, which is what, of course, happens at the end of the war. So you see a lot of end-of-the-war decisions being made here. FDR believed that he could negotiate and compromise with Stalin. And Stalin was a rational man, granted a very paranoid person and also a very brutal leader. But FDR believed you had to work with him, otherwise you're going to have another war, and he wanted to desperately avoid another war, especially on the end of the most devastating war in human history. Just to look at a map, this shows Germany at the final collapse, as it's being driven back by the Allies in the West, and of course the Soviets in the East. And then, of course, this picture is just one. This is a U.S. senator looking at some of the results of the Holocaust. It's incredible. It's an incredibly significant moment. The idea of genocide, really, as we think about it, international law and human rights, we really start thinking about these types of things in very serious ways after the atrocities committed by the Nazis, particularly on Jewish people, but not only Jewish people. There's about 6 to 7 million Jewish people who died in the Holocaust, but there was about 11 million people that died overall. And so about 6 to 7 million of those people were Jewish people, but some 4 to 5 million of those people were prisoners of war, were Slavic people, were Polish people, Russians. So it's a devastating atrocity that amounts to industrial slaughter of humanity. And of course, this event encourages the creation of the modern state of Israel after the war. It also creates the creation of human rights laws more than anything else. Anyway, this was kind of a long one. Sorry, guys. I hope it's informative. I hope it helps. All right. Have a great week.